Hello, welcome. My name is Aram Collier. I'm the head of programming at the Toronto Real Asian International Film Festival. I hope you enjoyed our presentation of Labyrinth of Cinema. Just a reminder that if you're watching live on CineSend and you want to ask our guests a question, and I think you'll have a lot of questions about this film, so please put it on the top of the chat. There's a bar, you can enter your question there. If you're on a phone, the chat will be on the bottom. So all questions, comments are subject to our code of conduct, realasian.com/code of conduct if you want to read about that. And if you'd like to have a discussion online, we join our Real Asian Film Forum, so realasian.com/film forum. This is towards the end of our festival, but lots of discussions going on and lots of opportunity to vote for your favorite films if you've seen other films in the festival. So for this Q&A, I'm really excited to have a discussion with our two guests, Rob Busher and Daisuke Miao, whose participation was made possible with the support from the CBC. But before we bring our guests on, I'd like to introduce a guest from our sponsor, the Asian Institute at the University of Toronto. Professor Tong Lam is the interim director of the Dr. David Chu program at the Asian Institute at the University of Toronto. His research areas include the modern and contemporary history of China, science and technology, politics and aesthetics, cities and empire. As a visual artist, he uses photographic and cinematographic techniques to dissect contemporary China's historical transformation, as well as Cold War ruins around the world. So welcome, Professor Tong Lam.
Thank you, Aaron. Good evening, everyone. So on behalf of the Dr. David Chu program in Asia Pacific Studies at the Asian Institute, I really would like to congratulate Real Asian for another very successful year of film festivals and be able to deliver the film festival in such a smooth way. And I'm sure there have been a lot of challenges, especially to do it entirely online. So this is really a big congratulations. The Dr. David Chu program in Asia Pacific Studies is one of the programs here at the Asian Institute that conduct cutting-edge research on Asia. Here at the Asian Institute, we do not simply approach Asia as a given object of study, but we also actively interrogate the idea of area. So in this case, it's the idea of Asia Pacific by calibrating and redefine and refine our research tools, methodology, etc. So the issue brought by this film by director Obayashi really exemplified the kind of critical rethinking of Japanese history with significant implications that is clearly beyond Japan. And those issues, as we all know, have become increasingly critical and urgent in our contemporary world. So our program is really proud to co-present this film with Real Asian. And so finally, I would just like to thank our two distinguished speakers today to participate in this panel, and I really look forward to the conversation very much myself. Thank you again, and enjoy the evening.
All right, thank you, Tom, and thank you to the Asian Institute. So now I'd like to first welcome on Rob Busher.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Rob. Hi. Can you tell us where you're joining us from today?
I am calling in from Philadelphia.
All right. Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Philadelphia. And next, Daisuke Miao.
Hi everyone.
Hi, Daisuke. Where are you joining us from today?
From San Diego, California.
All right. Warm and sunny and dry, I'm sure.
A little bit chilly today, though.
Okay. By San Diego standards, I'm sure.
Exactly.
So lots to talk about with this film. And I'm really happy to have you two here and really taking on the challenge and embracing the challenge of talking about all of the many elements in this. Labyrinth of Cinema, I think, is really true to its title. It's this dizzying journey through history, cinema, and the history of cinema. So I'm curious, this is a question for both of you. You both study cinema, you use cinema as a teaching tool in your work. What is the lens or the multiple lenses you watched this film through? So maybe Daisuke, can we start with you?
Sure. First of all, thank you very much for your generous invitation to this festival. I'm very honored to be here. And I particularly want to thank Professor Tak Fujitani as well for the generous invitation to this wonderful opportunity. And thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Rob. I have been looking forward to talking with you. Yeah, this is a very rich film by Obayashi. To me, this is a culmination of what he did throughout his career. So it's not only the history of cinema from the perspective of Obayashi, but also about his career all through. So yeah, we can talk about not only the history of Japan and the history of Japanese film history, but Japanese filmmaking by Obayashi's career itself. In that sense, I want to draw your particular attention to some issues that Obayashi has dealt with throughout his career. One of which is his hometown, Onomichi. It's a very cinematic city. Probably many of you know that Onomichi appeared in Yasujiro Ozu's arguably the most famous film, Tokyo Story. And Obayashi talked a lot about Ozu as well. So there is a connection between Ozu and Obayashi that we can think about. That's one thing, the significance of Onomichi as a place where the story sets in this film as well. The film theater is located in Onomichi, and we go through the history of Japan from this place, Onomichi. The second thing, of course, is about the war, the relationship between war and Obayashi. As far as I know, Obayashi didn't really experience the war itself directly because he lived in Onomichi, and Onomichi was fortunately avoided the air bomb from the U.S. military during the war. So Onomichi, fortunately, the city of Onomichi, everything stayed put. So all those houses, temples, shrines, beautiful architecture, all those architecture remained from pre-war time. That's beautifully shot in many of Obayashi films. But at the same time, Onomichi is very close to Hiroshima. So in his memory, in Obayashi's memory, I think the war, so throughout his career, he tried to visualize what he didn't really experience, so to speak. So memory of war or memory of invisibility of war is a very important theme for Obayashi. So those are the two major things that I want to draw your attention in relation to this film, The Labyrinth. So yeah.
Okay, yeah, and thanks, Daisuke. And Rob, to you. So, what were the various lenses you saw this film through? And then also, maybe after that, we can talk a little bit more of Obayashi's biography.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to echo Daisuke's thanks to both the festival, and I'm just excited to be having this conversation with both of you. As I had mentioned to Daisuke in an earlier conversation, I have one of his books on my desk on Sesshu Hayakawa. So glad to be in good company here as we talk about the history of cinema. Looking at this film in particular, my background scholarly is in Japanese cinema. I did a master's at the School of Oriental African Studies in Japanese cinema. And over the last decade, I've been a professional film programmer, first working in the United Kingdom, helping to co-launch the Zipangu Film Festival, which was the first Japanese film festival in the United Kingdom. And so in the last decade, my focus has shifted more to Asian diasporic cinema, and I chair the Philadelphia Asian American Film Festival's board. So in one sense, I look at this film from the perspective of a film programmer and understand and very much empathize with the folks at Toronto Real Asian at the challenge of programming a 3-hour film. Certainly, it is a very intense film to look at programming. It's very dense as a text. And I think most audiences might have a trouble getting into it without the kind of context for the history of Japanese modernity. For my own purposes, I found it really terrific because I've also been teaching courses on Japanese modernity over the last decade, and I specifically use Japanese film from the decades, basically from the birth of cinema until current day, to explore various periods of time in Japanese modernity. So looking at this film, Obayashi basically speaks directly to the audience several times and says, this is your history, and we're going to look at it through cinema. And if you want to understand the real history of Japan and the real history of Japanese relationship to war and conflict, you need to look at Japanese cinema too, because there are so many incredible texts throughout the history of Japanese cinema that look at not just conflict, but also the aftermath of conflict. And certainly in the post-war era, when Obayashi was really in his formative years, coming to understand the relationship that Japan had to imperialism in East Asia, to the disastrous effects of the war's closing chapter on the civilian population of Japan, and kind of observing this both as someone who clearly appreciated the history of Japan, but also as a creative and someone who wanted to kind of bring these stories to a younger generation in what he surely knew was going to be his last film. So I think that there is just so much that we can talk about in regards to this film. I'm really excited to delve into it. I guess the last thing that I'll just kind of mention, which we can talk about in more detail later if it suits the conversation. As a person of mixed race Japanese ancestry, my understanding of Japanese culture came from watching Japanese cinema. My great-grandmother, who was an Issei immigrant from Japan, she introduced me to the cinema of Japan, and it was through the films that we watched together that I had a sense of the history and the culture of Japan. So in that respect, I very much related to this film, and it resonated with me on a deeply personal level.
Thanks for that, Rob. And it's really interesting to see all these ways that that this film, all these things that it can access. Maybe Rob, can you expand a little bit on Obayashi's career and chronology a little bit? There may be some really ardent Obayashi fans, but there may be some people who don't know anything about Obayashi's work.
Absolutely. I'd be happy to. And Daisuke, feel free to jump in at any point as well. But, looking at the work that Obayashi did over his career, I think most people remember him for Hausu, right? And the very kind of off-the-wall, surrealist, horror, comedy, action film in the late 70s. And, rightly so, because the film is fantastic and it's very significant for a number of reasons. Most importantly, in my mind, the variety of experimental film techniques that he kind of brings into mainstream Japanese cinematic landscape. But prior to that, really throughout his entire career prior to Hausu, he had worked within experimental cinema. He helped to create these kind of Japanese experimental vocabulary as far as a filmmaker is concerned, and also within the editing room, using a lot of really interesting techniques that at this point, even digital filmmakers have a hard time replicating when they're not working with physical celluloid. Part of his background as a filmmaker, you think about the time period that he was raised, and I think, Daisuke, you mentioned that Obayashi, he didn't experience the war directly, right? I mean, he's born in 1938, so he was a child at the time that the war was ending. And, in that respect, he kind of grows up in one of the most turbulent times in Japanese history. This post-war era when Onomichi, his hometown itself, was not destroyed, but everything else was, right? And this idea that in the closing months of the war, amidst the firebombing campaign and certainly the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, over 75% of all urban infrastructure was completely obliterated from Japan. So you can imagine the time period that he's growing up as a youth and an adolescent, whatever memories that he has of childhood prior to the war or during the war, probably characterized by Japanese imperial propaganda, and then immediately afterwards kind of being redoctrinated by this like democracy that was coming in with the American occupation. And certainly, you know, filmmaking during this time period was incredible too. And you think about all of the great filmmakers like Kurosawa and Ozu who were working at this time period. But then also, you know, by the time that Obayashi was a teenager, he would have been watching films by folks in the Japanese New Wave, like Oshima, Imamura. And so kind of thinking about, you know, what impact that might have left on a young creative person who then eventually aspired to become a filmmaker themselves. I kind of look at him as the tail end between like the Japanese New Wave, which tended to be more in the studio system, and this true experimental cinema, which he really had a pretty significant role in developing within the Japanese context, playing around with a lot of these concepts that were originated, also having relationships with other pioneers like Donald Ritchie, the long-term Japanese film scholar and experimental filmmaker himself, going on to have work distributed through the Art Theater Guild, ATG, and then ultimately through the ATG in an unlikely source, beginning a career in commercial filmmaking or commercial cinema, actually directing television commercials for Japan, over 3,000 commercials throughout his career, and kind of looking at how do we bring these extremely interesting but very different experimental film techniques that he had perfected as a film student and later working with the Art Theater Guild into a mainstream commercial discourse. In some ways, I would argue Obayashi probably had more of an influence on Japanese popular media, at least from a visual aesthetic, than just about any one of his contemporaries. So, you know, it's exciting to kind of think about that impact. And, you know, again, this is all before he becomes known for Hausu. So by, you know, the late 70s, after Hausu comes out, he does have the attention of a more mainstream film audience, and begins to experiment with other techniques in a more conventional setting. He does have the Onomichi Trilogy of films, which we can kind of talk about a little bit later, largely talking about kind of coming of age issues. Certainly there's a lot of anti-war and pacifist themes that trace throughout his filmic career. And yeah, I think at the very end here, when we start to look at this as the very last film within his career, Labyrinth of Cinema, we should look at it also as his opportunity to kind of have a filmic obituary of himself in certain ways, right? I mean, this is the closing chapter, and as a storyteller, you want to finish with a strong finale, and I think he did just that.
Yeah, Daisuke, do you want to add on to any of that? You know, Rob covered a lot of territory there in terms of, you have
beautiful survey, and particularly his early career, which is very, very important to him. And I am really intrigued by your choice of words, new wave, and to me, Obayashi is the actual counterpart of French New Wave, or I can even say that Obayashi was the Japanese New Wave, because French New Wave filmmakers like Jean-Luc Godard, Eric Romer, François Truffaut, they didn't have any experiences of filmmaking at big studios. You know, they were film critics and they were huge film fans who watched so many films at the Cinémathèque Française and elsewhere. So they were huge film fans. And Obayashi, he didn't have any experiences of filmmaking at big studios. You know, he came in later than many filmmakers whom you have already mentioned, Rob, Ozu, Kurosawa, Mizoguchi, and so-called Japanese New Wave filmmakers like Oshima, Yoshida, Shinoda, and those people. You know, they all had the experiences of filmmaking at studios when Japanese New Wave started at Shochiku, one of the oldest and biggest studios in Japan. So New Wave, Shochiku New Wave was kind of like publicity or promotional words that were given from the producers. So of course, Oshima, Yoshida, Shinoda, they made very important rebellious films, so to speak, or challenging films against the dominant mode of filmmaking in the late 1950s, 1960s. But Obayashi came later than those people, without, like I said, any experiences at major film studios. So in that sense, he's very similar to Godard, Romer, and all those people, French New Wave. Obayashi, told us in various interviews that he learned so many things from watching films. So his knowledge about the war, his knowledge about Japanese modernity, and also American democracy and the American culture, the American way of life, it all came through, according to him, watching the movies, which is very similar to what those French New Wave filmmakers told us. They learned things from cinema. So in that sense, I think Obayashi was the Japanese New Wave filmmaker.
Rob, what do you think about that tying of I mean, it's always codifying things as new wave is always can be a little dicey, but what do you think of that kind of designation?
Well, it's funny because, in the Japanese studio context, they actually had the avant-garde and the new wave as labels that were embraced by the studio system, because they were essentially looking at how they could monetize on this new wave of filmmakers. And it was as simple as basically creating this social currency of, let's talk about new wave, let's talk about avant-garde, because these are concepts that the Japanese audiences were getting from overseas French films. And let's market it that way and package this thing and actually release it in the context of a studio. So, what Daisuke is referencing there is that essentially other filmmakers who, in my estimation, are acres above any of the American filmmakers working within the studio system as far as their very progressive politics during the 1950s and early 60s, they were still part of the studio system, right? Mm-hmm. So they're like actively being embraced for commercial purposes. What I find really interesting about that as well, though, it's sort of like, because these are the big studios that are releasing these films, and because the Japanese studio system is essentially a top-down system, so the same studio that produces the film releases it in a studio-owned theater, at least at that time period, it was guaranteed mass distribution throughout Japan. So you have these filmmakers that are producing things that I think at times were quite radical, coming from the likes of Oshima and Imamura in particular, with regards to their understanding of the post-war era and the relationship with the United States and the impacts of Japanese militarism and losing the war, and this kind of disconnect between the young generations growing up under the occupation of Japan and their parents, who essentially lost the war and were not, in their eyes, taking responsibility for the role that they had in that conflict. So, these are the kinds of films that I see Obayashi basically being influenced by before he was making his own films. And the reason why I can be so confident in him having been influenced by that is because of the fact that they were such popular studios that were releasing them. So I think that, any filmmaker that kind of comes out of that era, and certainly looking at the politics within Obayashi's films, you can tell that there's a clear through line to that earlier work of the new wave, but he does it in a very different way, right? And I think that's when we kind of look at the experimental technique that he's using, right?
Yeah, that's something I wanted to. Thanks for bringing that back around, because I was really interested in what you said about this kind of experimental vocabulary and this kind of tension between a commercial and kind of avant-garde approaches. So, can you expand a little bit about this kind of formal approach to these films?
Yeah. So, when we're actually looking at the film technique that he was using, things like slow motion, accelerated motion, blip-vert, fast cross-cutting, intermingled color with black and white. I mean, there's just so many different ways that he plays with the image of conventional cinema and really upends it on its head in a way that I think for your average Western viewer in particular has the impact of maybe taking you out from that suspension of disbelief that cinema kind of thrusts you into within narrative filmmaking. And I think to an extent also for Japanese audiences, certainly at the time when he was creating these films in the late 60s, early 70s in his experimental career, even as Hausu becomes kind of like a cult classic, definitely these are not things that the average filmmaker is doing, either in Japan or abroad. And we can even see, for those of you who saw the film, Labyrinth of Cinema certainly plays with a lot of these same kinds of techniques, although obviously being done in a digital cinema environment.
I was just going to ask if you felt this fell in line with that kind of aesthetic approach or formal approach.
Yes, I do. I do think it does. And I think, when you kind of look at the way that Obayashi adapted his techniques from, a manual filmmaking celluloid into a digital space, I think it translates quite nicely, actually, particularly because so much of this film was shot on green screen. And you think about, the limitations that might pose, especially for an older director like Obayashi was when he created this film. But I think that after a career of sort of thinking out of the box and this idea of unconventional filmmaking techniques sort of prepared him to be able to thrive in this environment. And I think, again, it depends on the cinematic viewing culture that you're coming from, but I think it really works. And I think it's a very unconventional way of telling the story that he's telling, but it's just uniquely, characteristically Obayashi.
So another thing that, part of, I'm curious, like how the formal approach works for this film, especially, and it fits into his larger work, these themes that you've both mentioned, memory of war or understanding, reconciling war through cinema. So what ways does this approach facilitate that? Maybe Daisuke, if you have any thoughts about
that. We can add one thing. This is a very materialistic approach as well. According to Obayashi, he started making his film when he was only 3 years old. He found 35 millimeter projectors and 35 millimeter celluloid films at his house in Onomichi. So it was about 1941, the year of the attack of Pearl Harbor. But he found those things in the attic of his house in Onomichi and started to play around with it, erasing all the images with some chemicals, and he painted with the crayons or the paints that he could find right next to those projectors. So he started making, let's say, animation by using all the available materials to him. So not only the formal approach that he was taking, he was also taking the very materialistic approach to making his films. So in that sense, in addition to that, the materialistic, formalistic, also Rob mentioned, he learned from earlier filmmakers, like new wave filmmakers played a significant role for him. But even before that, he was also strongly influenced by Kurosawa, Ozu, and in many of his films, stylistically speaking, he replicates or even emphasizes what Ozu tried to do, like directly looking into the camera or non-eye-line matches, right? I mean, the characters are not looking into the direction of the 180 rules and so on and so forth. So, speaking of Kurosawa, one of his Onomichi films is a direct reference to Kurosawa's debut film, Sanshiro Sugata. So, we can talk about those things in a combination, so to speak.
Actually, so I mean, Onomichi has come up a lot. So maybe we can talk about, and we've mentioned it a few times. It's geography, but let's expand upon that as the context that he's really working from. That appears so much in his work, and maybe Daisuke, you can pick up on that.
Sure. Onomichi is, I think, 10, 20 miles away from the city of Hiroshima. So it's in the same prefecture, Hiroshima Prefecture. And Onomichi is a port city facing Seto Naikai, or the ocean of Setouchi in Japan, between Honshu, the mainland, and Shikoku, the smaller island in Japan. But the location of Onomichi is fascinating because it's the Seto Naikai, Setouchi Ocean is very close to Shikoku Island at that point. So the ocean looks like a river. So the island facing Onomichi City it's very close. And also Onomichi has kind of high mountains in a very packed space. So it's a very cinematic city, so to speak. If you place a camera elsewhere, you can get both the ocean and the mountains and lots of, long and winding, hilly streets. So in that sense, Onomichi, is a fascinating place to shoot films. So that's the location of Onomichi. And like I said, it's very close to Hiroshima. So Obayashi talks a lot about his invisible experiences of atomic bomb, and he throughout his career he tries to capture what he couldn't see by using materials, objects like film cans or the canned food that he got from the American armies who passed through the city of Onomichi, and so on and so forth. So Onomichi is a city very close to Hiroshima. At the same time, it's a very scenic city that has ocean and the mountain.
Mm-hmm. Rob, you had mentioned that he has set many films there. I think like a kind of coming of age set of films too. Maybe you can expand on kind of Onomichi's representation.
Absolutely. So, some of his really popular films from the early 80s, a trilogy of films that I think folks have started calling the Onomichi Trilogy, they all were set there. The first was I, Are You, You and Me, which came in 1982, The Girl Who Leapt Through Time in the following year, and then Chizuko's Lonely Hearts in 1985. So those were
Can you hold those up, Daisuke, actually?
I have two.
So, when you think about what does it mean, not only from like the geographic standpoint, and obviously all filmmakers are kind of seeking to imbue the stories they tell with aspects of their own lives in some capacity. Regardless of his own experience in Onomichi, the setting, I think, is very significant. One, for its history in just Japan's long history of commerce and trade in the inland sea. It's always been a significant site of commerce and exchange. But then also, I think it's an idyllic kind of environment, especially during the post-war era. Daisuke had mentioned earlier the idea that because there was an American POW camp nearby, Onomichi was actually spared from any of the fire bombings at the end of World War II, which meant that essentially the city remained in the same format that it had in hundreds of years prior to that. So when you kind of look at what the experiences may have been for someone living in Onomichi compared to most other Japanese youth of the post-war era, you would imagine that regardless of the rationing and other impacts that may have adjusted the lives of Obayashi and his family, he was still living in probably a much nicer existence than a lot of his contemporaries in other cities that were destroyed. So, that aspect of childhood, and I think although many of the characters are flawed in the Onomichi trilogy, although there are conflicts that they come up against, there's this aspect of, I think, adolescent youth, the magic of youth, right? Because they essentially deal with paranormal powers or other abilities that are being given to the characters who are kind of going through that process of adolescence and essentially coming through on the other end, deciding that they would rather be normal, quote unquote. So maybe that was Obayashi's way of kind of exploring his own experience growing up in that environment as sort of a microcosm of post-war Japan that was quite different, I think, than a lot of other people of his age group. Almost like a safe environment to kind of watch from afar, again, invoking that idea of invisible memory, things that his generation lived through in the vast majority of the country, but he might not be able to relate to directly from his lived experience.
So if we're gonna talk about Onomichi in this film, I mean, neither of you are Obayashi, but how do you read the setting of this film in Onomichi?
Yeah. The geography of Onomichi is very important to me, especially it has the vertical, differences between the high and the low, and the long and winding streets that connects the high and low. I may be able to talk about Kurosawa's high and low in relation, but in any case, as Rob mentioned, this connection or the switch from one area of, let's say, imagination to another, or reality versus fantasy. The connection is emphasized, or the disconnection is emphasized because of different geographical spaces of Onomichi. So if a character goes up to the hill, he or she may be, going from the realistic world of commerce near the inland sea to somewhere else. And the other way around, Obayashi himself grew up in the upper side, upper hill of Onomichi, a little bit richer side. But when he goes down to the ocean area, maybe he faces the reality around himself, around the growing, himself growing up. Not just from around the fantastic world, but in reality surrounded by the contemporaneous people around him and the war. So the geography of Onomichi, like I said, the height and the lower part, it plays a very significant role in his life as well as in his films. And I think Labyrinth of Cinema, this latest film, captures that ambiguous line between reality and fantasy in a very interesting way, especially in the form of the heroine Noriko.
Mm-hmm. Rob, did you want to speculate on anything, or do you read it more as just a kind of like also a self-reference kind of thing, like what you mentioned that this film is a bit of a self-obituary in a way?
Yeah, I mean, you think about it from that perspective, and I think there are aspects of the film that are absolutely autobiographical, including actually that story that Daisuke was mentioning before in terms of the magic lantern and 35 millimeter projector that one of the characters actually brings with him into the ofuro, the bath, and washes away the image, and then he uses his own pencils to mark up an animation. So if we know that was part of a story from his real life, then what else in the film is also from his real life? Part of it to me was him saying goodbye to Onomichi. I mean, this is his love letter to the town that meant so much to him as a child and his adolescence, but then also played such a pivotal role in his career as a filmmaker. And in the early years when he was really kind of making a name for himself in more mainstream Japanese cinema, Onomichi was the basis of those stories. So then on top of that, we also think about how much of a role that the history of cinema plays within this film. And it's, I think, to me, as much about the history of Japan as it is the history of cinema. And there's so many reference points kind of throughout to different key films and time periods within Japanese filmmaking. Onomichi plays a central role in so many of those, right? Because as we've mentioned a few times, there are films that are shot by Ozu, by Kurosawa, by Shindo Kaneto, by other filmmakers throughout the history of Japanese filmmaking. And I think for him to set the film in Onomichi was very much a reference to the central role that this has played kind of over that lifespan of Japanese cinema, and also maybe setting up the audience to understand that, this is the constant within the story, and we're going to kind of reflect upon each of these moments as they were experienced through the eyes of the filmmakers who were making their works here. But then I think the third and final thing to kind of think about here, again, referencing that idea of Onomichi being kind of this idyllic place during the post-war era, Tokyo Story by Ozu, like the rural scenes are all set in Onomichi, right? So it's that juxtaposition to the very rapid urban lifestyle in Tokyo against the backdrop of then, this is how more traditional people are living their lives. And so I think that there's a callback to that in a large way.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned some really good points that I wanted to talk about next, is that not sure which one to talk about first, but you mentioned the references to historical points in cinema, and then you talk about references to Japanese history. So I'm wondering which one we should talk about first. Daisuke, you mentioned, he's very much a student of cinema history, but we start the film and it's essentially actually a stage show, right? And so maybe not quite a vaudeville show, but there's lots of tap dancing. So so maybe we can talk about that a little bit, about the trajectory of the references in cinema, and then we can also talk about the history. The references of history. Actually, I mean, they're so intertwined in the film, so let's just talk about them both at the same time.
Well, speaking of stage, Obayashi himself learned tap dancing, so he was able to tap dance, like Takeshi Kitano. Anyway, Obayashi uses his older film footages in this film as well. Especially when he plays the character of John Ford, film director who came to Japan after the war to record the aftermath of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima, and a Japanese cinematographer accompanied him. His name is Harry Mimura Akira. He's a very interesting character in this film, as well as in his earlier. So that particular sequence is, from Obayashi's earlier film. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thank you, Rob. Yeah, so John Ford, character that Obayashi himself plays, and Kobayashi Nenji plays Harry Mimura Akira, cinematographer. So Harry Mimura, he started his career in Hollywood in the 1930s, and he worked with George Barnes, who received his Oscar for Rebecca, and he was also a colleague of Greg Toland, who shot Citizen Kane with Orson Welles, and so many important films in Hollywood using deep focus cinematography. So, but Harry Mimura was the one who was chosen to accompany an American filmmaker. Or there was no record that John Ford came to Japan to capture the aftermath of a bomb. But Obayashi chose John Ford character because he loves John Ford films. But anyway, so Harry Mimura accompanied him because of his Hollywood connection. So that's one thing that I can point out in terms of the relationship between the history of American films released in Japan and the personal connection between Japan and Hollywood film history, and then Obayashi's own career, his older film, which was very important to him when we think about the history of Japan and the history of film. He was brought back to this film as a significant part.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Did you want to add on to that a little bit, Rob?
Absolutely, and I think that definitely that particular vignette when we see John Ford a la Obayashi in that particular portion of the film. It's just another clever reference, I think, to both his childhood as well as the interrelation between cinema and the memories of war, right? Because the reference point there of Ford being in Japan specifically to capture the aftermath of the atomic bombing, and what an important role that has played, both in terms of U.S.-Japan relations in the post-war era, but also both the position of the United States and Japan in a larger, like, global political landscape. Japan sort of, taking on the international pacifist approach and looking at through much of the last 75 years, being sort of in this very unique space as a country that doesn't technically have a military, although obviously the Japan Self-Defense Force has become much more proactive in the recent decade. But, the United States also, I think, claims much of its hegemony from the post-war era by being, at the time, the sole nuclear power, right? And having atomic weapons before the Soviet Union did. And basically, cementing their role as global policemen with this sort of big stick approach that, we have the weapon. I think there's an importance to remembering that from both sides of the conflict. And obviously, Obayashi, as someone who was a resident of Hiroshima-ken, the prefecture, not the city, very much would have understood the travesty of the atomic weapon and the incredible devastation, unimaginably so, on the city and its residents. I think a lot about the history of nuclear stigma within Japanese artistic psyche, and particularly in post-war filmmaking, but also in experimental art forms too, right? And thinking about, some of the contemporary movements to experimental Japanese cinema, like Buto dance, or other types of experimental visual art forms that were essentially in reaction to the horror of nuclear warfare. And these things are part of that conversation too. And I think it's kind of interesting how that represents itself several times in the film. I mean, in a very literal sense, we have the three boys at one point with the theater troupe in the day before the atomic bomb is dropped in Hiroshima. We also have the character who is being chased through time, who is revealed to have died within the atomic bombing. In fact, I think I have a slide of that here, but the image of the atomic shadow, or the nuclear shadow rather, on the steps of the A-bomb dome. This particular scene is, I think, really telling for anyone who's spent any time in Hiroshima or the Genbaku no Koen, the Peace Park. You've probably seen the image of the steps with a shadow on it where a person was actually sitting, and they were eviscerated by the bomb, and that was all that was left of them. So these kinds of direct reference points, things that are extremely unpleasant to think about or talk about, and unfortunately are not things that a lot of Japanese youth would probably know. If you're not from Hiroshima or don't have ties to that region. Because again, this history of the warfare and the impact that it had on Japan, and certainly the role that US-Japan has played in the post-war era, has made a lot of people reluctant to talk about the horrors of warfare. And obviously this is central to the theme of the film in a lot of ways. So, I think maybe we could reflect on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a recurring thing that happens in the film, and I think, but it's surprising to me to hear that people don't, young people maybe don't know that much about it, because I mean, maybe it's just because I took a lot of history classes, but like that is a relatively well-known thing. But there's a lot of other historical instances in this film that are probably much less well-known too. I'm wondering if we can go through a few of those. So you had mentioned the Boshin War. There's the military occupation in China, Okinawa as well, massacres in Okinawa.
Yeah, so I can just kind of give a broad overview, and then Daisuke, please feel free to jump in here. But the way that I see it, like so much of his work in the later years of his career, Obayashi was really trying to send a message to future generations through this film. And I think the fact that he did a trilogy of anti-war films just prior to this is really revealing in that, this was the direction that he was moving towards. Obviously, this is an extremely anti-war film, but it does so in the unconventional way of sort of retelling all of these important conflicts that Japan has participated in. And I think he does so for a variety of different reasons, right? And thinking a little bit about the Meiji Restoration and the impact that had on the formation of Japanese modernity. I'm going to switch to a slide again here. But yeah, basically, when you look at some of the images that he had in this particular segment of the film, the slide that I'm showing here has 3 of the key figures of early Japanese modernity who all died at the hands of kind of treachery in one way or another. And between Okubo, Sakamoto, and Saigo, the 3 men, Obayashi credits as kind of the founding fathers of this type of Japanese modernity. In this particular scene, he asks the audience, what would Japan have been like if they had lived longer and if they had seen more of their visions realized? So I think that's kind of an interesting point to look at. One of the other aspects of this particular segment of the film, he does jump between visual styles that are trying to replicate the silent era of Japanese film, right? He shows like jidaigeki, like samurai period dramas, done in black and white as if it was a silent film, very much in the style of cinema that a lot of the early filmmakers were using to tell these kinds of similar stories. So it kind of works on a couple of different levels. But there are a couple of other instances, as you mentioned. I think the fact that we go from kind of a conflict in Japan and a civil conflict into Japanese imperialism, that's a really important component within the film, because it's not just a story about Japan and itself. It's really outwardly looking at how Japan was the perpetrator of different aggressive violence in Asia, and particularly the colonization of China. And really delving into some of the atrocity that was committed by Japanese soldiers at that time, which depending on who you are, is not a popular topic within Japan, right? And there's many contemporaries of Obayashi who may publicly refuse to acknowledge the atrocities that the Japanese military committed during that time period, to the extent that it really hasn't been fully fleshed out in a lot of curriculum within Japanese history books. So it's important that this was in the film. I think one of the other aspects of this that we see kind of represented at one point in the film, there is a direct reference to the Okinawan Genocide, right? And we see like the numbers of Okinawan civilians who are being massacred at one scene in the film by a Japanese soldier. It was surprising to me to see that presented on screen. I wasn't anticipating that to be one of the flesh points in this history of Japanese conflict. But obviously for Obayashi, this was something that he really cared to highlight and wanted people to think about in terms of how does contemporary Japan define itself. Going from a small island nation into an empire that had colonized most of Asia and still retaining Okinawa in the post-war era. And this idea that, a lot of folks from outside of Japan don't necessarily question that, in the same way that a lot of Americans don't question that Hawaii is a state, right? So a few different really interesting call points here that I kind of wanted to highlight for you all. And, that was just some of the high points for me.
Daisuke, did you have any response to these Obayashi referencing these specific moments, or curious what you have?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, some of the history of modern Japan. It is important to include those issues, topics that are not in the textbooks. But at the same time, growing up in Japan and taking those history courses at the elementary school, junior high school, and high school, what I experienced was that, there was almost no course or no class spent for the modern Japanese history in those era. Nowadays they are changing, I think. But when I was a elementary school kid, junior high school kid, all the history courses ended around the beginning of the Edo era. So even early modern history of Japan, we didn't really learn at school. And Obayashi was a strong believer of the educational aspect of cinema. Even though he was against propaganda films, he was believed in the educational power of cinema. So it is, I want to repeat what Rob said. It is very important to include those scenes in this popular format. Even if pre-war era, Obayashi didn't experience those things in his real life. According to him, I'm repeating myself, but Obayashi learned the history of Japan as well as the history of Hollywood by way of cinema. But from his perspective, he tried to say some educational, pedagogical things about what Japan experienced after the Meiji Reconstruction in a popular format. I think that was a very, very important thing that Obayashi tried to do. At the same time, what I want to point out is, Obayashi was dubious about the realism or reality that the cinema could convey or represent. So I was really intrigued by the image that you have shown to us, Rob, the image of the shadow. Right? And I mentioned some materialistic approach that Obayashi took. So Obayashi was against, or he was very, very doubtful about representing the atomic bomb, for example, in cinema. It was for him impossible to capture the horror, actuality, the reality of a bomb or the war itself. So instead, he chose a shadow of a canned food, or a shadow of something that is left, onto the ground or the soil of Japan, in order to facilitate the imagination of the audiences about the horror, the fearful reality of what happened to Japan, especially during the war. So, he was a strong believer of the educational aspect of cinema, but at the same time, he knew or he understood the limit of reality that cinema could convey.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious to, if you look at this film in its totality, it's with all these references to cinema history, to Japanese history, war history, and put it in a contemporary context. Like I love, and I'm going back to it again, but Rob, how you said this was kind of like a self-obituary in a way, and it's very intentional in the end. He I'm paraphrasing, but he offers a word to the next generation who he hopes doesn't know war. And he says, how does he put it? We offer this to you with envy, right? So if you look at it in its totality and put it in the contemporary context, what do you think? And that context of it being an obituary, what do you think that he is trying to offer people who might see this film?
So on a personal level, I want to say that it probably has a lot to do about conservative politics within Japan current day, in the sense that under the Abe administration, there has been this return to kind of aggressiveness within the Japan Self-Defense Force, participating in multinational peacekeeping missions in a way that previous administrations did not, and gradually kind of reducing some of the restrictions on producing arms within Japan. So, the reality, I think, is that Japan is kind of moving closer to becoming a full-fledged military state again, right? And I think it's been 75 years since the end of World War II. we would be naive to think that a country would indefinitely be demilitarized after a conflict like that, regardless of how disastrous the outcome. Obviously, that presents a lot of fears, and I think exacerbates some existing tensions in other East Asian and Southeast Asian countries that experience Japanese imperialism firsthand, but also among members of the elder generation in Japan who remember firsthand how terrible the aftermath of World War II was, the people who lived through the post-war occupation, the people who have direct knowledge of the families and individuals who were killed or maimed in the fire bombings, or worse yet, the atomic bombings. This is his opportunity to say to the people who are living and the people who are yet to be born, this is the reason why Japan should not be involved in war. And I think he understands, he was a realist in the sense that I think he understood that the limitation of cinema, you can't force someone to do something, but if you present at least a valuable counterpoint of information, knowing that most of the younger generations are not particularly well versed in this history, this is his last-ditch effort to basically give them that on his way out, as I would say.
Daisuke, did you want to add on to that in terms of kind of putting this film in contemporary context?
Yes. I think Obayashi was also thinking about the aftermath of 3/11 or the Tohoku earthquake that hit Japan in 2011. So he kind of juxtaposed the war and the aftermath of what happened, the meltdown in Fukushima. So he was in a way, he was using the war as a metaphor of what happened to Japan after 3/11. So in that sense, Obayashi experienced the disaster or man-made disaster in 2011, even if he didn't experience the actual bombing in Hiroshima when he was a kid. So it was like a reliving of, the Japanese modern history and the results of it. So he was, in that sense, this is obitually a film that Rob has mentioned, but at the same time, it's a very contemporary film that he was thinking about what is happening in Japan after 2011.
Mm-hmm. And sorry, I just wanted to go back and say what the actual quote was. I found it well. So it says in the end of the film, it says, "To young people who want a future where no one knows war, we dedicate this movie with blessing and envy." So I just wanted to clarify that because I had forgotten exactly what it was, but I wanted to get it right. And I believe he's the piano player in the end of the movie too, right? So just a little Easter egg there. But I wanted to, we have some questions that have come through the chat. So some of it we've touched upon a little bit, but maybe we can expand upon them a little bit. So one of them is person's asking, I want to know about how the guests see the relationship between aesthetics and memory of war, especially one that Obayashi experiences secondhand playing out in Labyrinth. So maybe you can expand upon an example where you're seeing that aesthetics and memory of war play out.
So to me, going back to that example that I used earlier of the nuclear shadow, something like that is a really great way to understand both the materialism of this physical impact of what's left after a war. And so being able to look at something, hold something in your hand, see it with your own eyes, stand on the same ground, it gives a physicality to history. And I think that this is something that you cannot argue with, right? So by showing something like this, you can argue about ideas, you can have differing opinions, there are multiple viewpoints in history, but when you have a physical object, you can't really argue with that object, right? And I think, at least in this particular example, this is one really good example of him showing that. Obviously, other aspects of it, in particular, the elder woman who talks about the Picadome and her remembrances of the atomic bombing, those kinds of transience of memory, the unreliability of memory, the malleability, right? All of these aspects about how we interpret experiences, particularly traumatic experiences, and then may remember them slightly differently at different points in our lives. That to me is similar to cinema, right? In the sense that you have all filmmaking is sort of unreliable in the sense that it's, unless you're physically documenting something as it's happening, it's just a close approximation of it. Even, many documentaries are staged, the shots, right? So you're kind of impacting your own perspective. You're placing the viewer in your shoes and perspective by doing so. So in one sense, I think Obayashi's playing with this idea by kind of suggesting that all narrators are unreliable to an extent, but there are certain aspects of the history that are so tangible that, you cannot argue with them, and such as that nuclear shadow example.
Yeah, I cannot agree with you more, Rob. Yeah, and I was really struck by the image of the shadow in that particular scene. What I want to add to that particular sequence or the film itself was this notion of the return of the repressed, the ghost. One thing that we might not have touched upon in today's talk is the ghost cat film or genre that Obayashi touched upon through his career. Irie Takako, who was a huge star during the silent era of Japanese filmmaking. She after World War II, she made a comeback as a ghost cat actor or actress in the 1950s. And even the daughter of Irie Takako appeared in many of Obayashi films. In any case, ghost cats, they are the characters who are, who embodied the misery, the victimization of the patriarchal system, and sometimes the war itself. So using the character of Irie Takako or the ghost cat type of character throughout his film, Obayashi is not only thinking about the reclamation of the genre, the forgotten genre, but also about this victimized or repressed characters of the past. He is also thinking about the gender issues, which was a very problematic issue throughout the modern history of Japan, or maybe not only in Japan, but also in the world. But in any case, so the return of the repressed in the form of Noriko, in this case, in this film, is very important in that particular sequence of the shadow. And the name of Noriko is also very important if we think about the Ozu films and Onomichi in Tokyo Story. Noriko is the character, the same name of the character Tetsuko Hara played in Tokyo Story.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. So I have another question. It says, I was wondering if the panelists could talk about their thoughts of the use of Chuya Nakahara's poetry as a framework or springboard for the film and the interplay between film and literature. So you want to take that one first, Rob?
I'm just glad that someone brought it up, because I realized that we did forget to mention it earlier. And I mean, this was such a central plot device within the film. So from a filmmaking standpoint, it's very interesting. But Nakahara's work, I have to admit, I wasn't that familiar with his poetry prior to watching this film, and I've done a bit of research on him since. I was fascinated to learn that he really was considered kind of like the Japanese equivalent of Arthur Rimbaud, the French Dadaist poet. And in that respect, I can kind of understand a little bit better. Perhaps Obayashi was kind of viewing this as a literary equivalent of some of the transnational conversations that he was having through cinema. The same way Nakahara is kind of doing that within a literary circle. One of the other commonalities that I found, I don't think that Obayashi's father was as strict as Nakahara's, but I know they were both doctors. So this idea of coming from a doctor household where the expectation is that you will grow up to be a medical professional and then turning to the creative arts may have also been something that developed an affinity for him.
Daisuke, would you care to add on Nakahara?
Yes, not particularly on Nakahara per se, but Obayashi throughout his career said that he wanted to make a equivalent of bungaku or pure literature in a cinematic form. He made, or many Japanese filmmakers, adopted bungaku, or the literature, to films. But Kobayashi said many of them ended up becoming just a melodrama, just followed the main plots of the literature, literary forms. But what Kobayashi wanted to do, using all those cinematic styles, techniques that we have already discussed, is to create cinematic literature. So in this case, I think he wanted to make a cinematic poetry, referring to Nakahara Chuya, especially when Nakahara Chuya, like Rob said, he was a kind of a Japanese American author, and that is experimental poet, and he was also conscious about minority poetry, Native American poetry, and Okinawan poetry as well. So he was, I think Obayashi was trying to, refer to all those minority literature or poetry by way of Nakahara Chuya in this film as well.
Okay. And did you want to add anything about the interplay between those two? Just how and actually, can you just explain what a bunraku is too, if people don't know what that is? You just
you mean literature, or I didn't say bunraku or puppet theater.
Oh, sorry. That's what I heard. No wonder you both were looking at me like, what are you talking about?
That's an interesting point as well, because, in some cases, Obayashi uses, actors or characters as kind of the puppets of the puppet theater, bunraku. So I think artificiality, at one point, Obayashi said he likes his actors to read the lines in a very unemotional or unattached way. If the actors play those roles in a very emotional ways, then it became kind of like high school theatrical play or something like that. So instead, he wanted to, like Ozu did the same way to when he made his films. So he wanted the actors to say the lines in a very flat, strategically flat way to, for us, the viewers, to go into the characters in a strangely realistic way, not by way of melodramatic, emotional way.
Great. We have another question, and it kind of I think it touches upon a little bit of what we've talked about a little bit, but there's a lot of editing in the film, such as the beheadings, green screen effects, and subtitles and captions jumped out to me, especially in comparison to many other films that are more focused on realism rather than employing or making use of a sense of artificial. Could the guest talk a little bit more about the employment or roles of these techniques? It's a long question, but I think you can see the notes.
We talked a little bit about some of the technique, but I want to kind of return to that idea that Obayashi spent so much time making television commercials, right? And you think about what you need in a television commercial for it to be successful. You have at most 30 seconds to grab the attention of your viewer amid whatever else they might be doing that distracts them in a commercial break between a show. And before that, he was working in experimental film. So he was kind of given like a blank check to go and make really exciting, strange, bizarre, off the wall, and very profitable commercials for these major Japanese consumer goods manufacturers through Dentsu. And, I think in a large way, I kind of referenced earlier that I really credit him in a certain way to having a very large impact on the way that Japanese viewing culture has shaped in kind of the 1970s and beyond, certainly in the 80s and beyond. But the idea of, from a Western standpoint, there's a suspension of disbelief that I think we're pulled out of when we see certain techniques used on screen. Like seeing something like the, any of these green screen or beheadings, things that are comical overtly, playing with conventions that I think are typical now within Japanese popular culture, and particularly cinema and television. But we just can't necessarily wrap our heads around if you're not familiar with that style of storytelling or viewing culture. But even something as simple as the waido shows and the variety shows, right, in Japan, that make use of a lot of these very interesting techniques that certainly we don't see on American daytime talk television. It just is indicative of the more innovative and I think experimental nature of the Japanese film vocabulary.
And editing is very important. Obayashi was the editor of his own films in many cases, so it is very nice of you to point out about the editing in this particular film as well. And I'm repeating myself, but he was very conscious. Obayashi was very conscious about the artificiality of cinema and the limits of reality. So the other way around, he was consciously or strategically using the visibility of such artificiality by using, various types of editing and layering of images in one shot, so to speak, using a very, physical, materialistic ways of, connecting images, like the 1970s Star Wars, the films like Star Wars uses, mix of images in one shot in a very artificial manner. And Obayashi was a big fan of, using those optical process. So he was, replicating similar type of, optical process in this digital film as well. But in any case, Obayashi, like I said, was very consciously reminding us of the artificiality of cinema, and he sometimes referred to early masters like Kurosawa, how Kurosawa edited his films. Kurosawa used the technique called wipe quite often, so one image is replaced by another very violently, by like a curtain, right? So Obayashi uses that kind of very violent visual editing as well in his films for the particular purpose of revealing the artificiality of cinema.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're reaching towards the end of our time. I did want to ask a couple of quick things. Just real quick, if you had any last thoughts about the film, about Obayashi, and also which of his films is your favorite. So maybe Rob, we could start with you.
Well, closing thoughts on the film. I think the film really kind of speaks for itself. Kurosawa famously said in his autobiography, "If you want to know the real me, then look into my movies." And I get the sense that Obayashi very much kind of had the same viewpoint, particularly with this film. But, knowing the trajectory that his work was on in the past decade, certainly, and I'm glad that Daisuke brought up the 3/11 triple disaster, because that certainly did play a large role in the anti-war film trilogy that he had done just previous to this. So, thinking about that sort of trajectory of looking at what Japan's future might hold, particularly after his departure, knowing that he was battling fatal diagnosis with cancer. This was his very last opportunity to have a direct message to the world. And I think he did it in a way that was true to himself and true to his career, and also really admirable in terms of its approach to helping a younger generation to understand the realities of Japanese modernity, and then doing it in such a way that he felt would potentially impact these individuals. So, it's an exciting film. I'm glad that it now exists in the world. I'm certainly going to teach it in my classes from here on out when I teach about Japanese modernity. And then my favorite film, this may be a bit cliched, but Houseu, I've probably seen like 50 times at this point. One, because I love the film, but also because I've been teaching it for a decade. And, yeah, I mean, that film will never get old to me. Every time I watch it, I notice something new, whether it's something down to a minute detail of the set or a different reference point that he's using to perhaps a kaidan type ukiyo-e showing some of the folk tales of Japan that he references throughout the film. I also just love introducing it to students because I kind of tell them, this is like the equivalent of Frank Zappa to like Japanese cinema, at least in the context of this film. And imagine, a slasher flick made by Japanese hippies. But yeah, I love his work. I'm sorry that he's gone, but I think this film certainly does credit to him and his entire career.
I am currently reading this recent book on Obayashi, this thick book. Obayashi, talks about all of his films in this book. It was just published last month. And instead of, giving my final word, I want to quote just a little bit from this book. So it's in Japanese, so this is my English translation, but I don't want to say how I depicted the war. I am making films because there was a war. If there hadn't been the war, I don't think I was making any films. Right? So, this is what we have discussed so far today, right? About reality, about the memory of war, his attitude toward cinema, his attitude toward the war. My favorite film, I think I go with Tenkose, or I are you, you am me. That's the English title, I think. This is the first film about Onomichi, and this is the film that I think captured his way of capturing the war, his way of capturing the history of cinema. So yeah, I go with Tenkose.
All right, great. And for folks watching, you can battle that out online, which one is your favorite too. But it's great to offer up your insights about this film, all of Obayashi's work, give people an entry point to it. And thank you, Daisuke, for that really great translation from a new source. So, and it's a great way to end off on. Usually at the end of things, we ask filmmakers, "What's your next film?" But but he's not here. But so tell us what you're working on. Anything coming up for you, Rob?
Well, the Philadelphia Asian American Film Festival just had its closing night film last Sunday, so thankfully we're all going to get a bit of sleep, except for me because I just welcomed my first child 5 weeks ago. So wish me luck.
Well, congratulations on both parts, and the Philly Asian Film Festival is incredible. So, congratulations, Daisuke. Anything you wanna?
Oh yeah, just if I'm allowed.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I want to publicize my new book, Japanism and the Birth of Cinema. This is the most recent book written by me, and this is my way of thinking about the modern history of Japan and the world. So Obayashi, I think, is making his next film in the heaven, and yeah, I want to keep talking about his legacy. From the perspective of what I'm familiar with and what I am interested in continuing my research, which is the archaeology of cinema, film history, and the modern history of Japan. So thank you very much.
Congratulations on the book, and we gotta hook Rob up with a copy too. So. So thank you both. That's all the time that we have. I wanted to thank Rob and Daisuke for joining us for this really expansive talk. I wanted to thank Chris and Jamie from Toronto Sign Language Interpreter Services, And to our producers, Mimi Vong and Josephine Cruz, Kelly and Atif on the back end, moderating the chat. And if you'd like to discuss more, please join our film forum. Reminding everybody that Relation has one more day. So tomorrow, as of this recording, so tickets are now on sale only for our Codes of Contact panel and our Scarborough live script read. So please check those out at realasian.com. Just a reminder, our audience award voting is still open. So if you watched some of these films, go back and vote. There are cash prizes, including the first time that we've ever had an audience award for short films. So please, these filmmakers need your votes. So we hope to see you watch a few more films, and everybody just take care and stay safe.